اليوم علق على خشب الذي علق الأرض على المياه اليوم علق على خشب فأرنا قيامتك المجيدة
Good evening. Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. This is Craig Trulia. With me today is the author, one of the co-authors of Syria Crucified, Brad Hoff. How are we doing today?
Great. So good to be here.
Well, it's great to have you on this topic because of your background in this area, the issue of Syria and the geopolitical events and their effects on Orthodox Christians in that community. And it'll be pretty much on that note we'll start the interview, if that sounds good with you.
Sure.
And so, for those not aware, you lived in Syria and you were former military. And so, to perhaps contextualize how you got to know what the goings on in Syria were and what led you to understand these geopolitical machinations, what motivated you to enlist in the Marines back in the day?
Well, I actually was part of that generation that signed up right around 9/11. And, two things happened. I entered the Marine Corps, and within a short period of time, I discovered Orthodoxy, coming from a kind of Baptist evangelical background. And in fact, the first Orthodox church I'd ever walked into is called St. Anthony the Great Antiochian Orthodox Church in the Houston area. It's actually not far from Father John Whiteford's parish, St. Jonah. A lot of great Orthodox churches in that area. But as a young man, I walk into this very foreign, exotic-looking church and experience. And one thing that really stuck with me for a couple of years after, and it was still a couple of years before I actually took the plunge, so to speak, and became Orthodox, was the fact that the church was filled with Lebanese, Palestinians, Syrian Christians, and in my sort of Baptist evangelical mind at the time, I read about the city of Antioch in the book of Acts, or Tyre and Sidon, and I think these are these kind of fantasy land, no longer around, remote places. Maybe something you might see as a recreation at Disneyland. I actually hear there's some kind of biblical Disneyland tour you can go on. And what that experience left me with this firsthand, shock realization that there are still Christians in the Middle East. And as I got to talk to some of these people, they said, well, there's actually millions of Christians still in the Middle East, and there's still a place called Antioch. There's still a place called Damascus. It's dotted with churches. There's still a Tyre and Sidon and Beirut, and you go there and churches dominate the skyline. And so that really planted the seeds. At the same time, I'm in the Marine Corps. As an enlisted Marine, I got stuck at Quantico in Quantico, Virginia, which is actually a good place to get stuck if you're going to get stuck anywhere in the Marine Corps. And it's actually there that I entered the Orthodox Church. But it was also at the same time I started reading more deeply. I read St. John of Damascus. I read a lot of church history. And, when you read church history, you encounter the Levant pretty quickly. You encounter the Near East. as this heartbeat of Christian civilization. And again, it really cut across the grain of what I was used to. I think most modern Americans think of Christianity as a Western thing, or even a white man's religion. When you find out its origins are in the Near East, and it's rooted in the culture of the Near East. And so one book in particular I discovered as a young Marine was William Dalrymple's From the Holy Mountain. He's a famous Scottish historian and travel writer who mimicked the spiritual journey of St. John Boscos. St. John Boscos lived in the 7th century, and he just went around the ancient monasteries of Egypt, of Syria, Palestine, at a time of that kind of last generation of the early Desert Fathers. And in a kind of travelogue way, he records what he sees, and he has conversations with spiritual elders. And so that book especially, once I got out of the Marine Corps, got my honorable discharge, I did not want to re-up, especially because by then I started some of the kind of, let's say, myths or illusions I was fed in that early post 9/11 period about America's role in the world began to be undone. And I thought, I need to see for myself. I want to go to these places. I want to go to Lebanon, Syria, the Holy Land, Asia Minor. So I saved up some money that I had from my military service and strapped on a backpack and went touring around the Middle East. And that was sort of my initial exposure to this whole topic. And if you had gone back in time and told me at the age of 21, 22, 23 years old, one day you're going to meet a Syrian Christian woman, marry her, and sort of through that experience live in Syria off and on, and then eventually write a book about it, I wouldn't have believed them. But that was my initial exposure to this whole Middle East Christian world. And I will say that even as much sort of head knowledge as I had going into my initial travels in the Middle East, I was still overwhelmed by the fact that I discovered, and this is a lot of why my co-author and I wrote this book. I discovered Christians in the Middle East are not like merely on the sidelines, and they're not some teeny persecuted side element in many of these Middle East societies, especially places like Lebanon and Syria, and maybe to some degree Egypt. But they are integrated into society. Their civilization is older than the Islamic civilization that kind of came and politically subjugated them. And they're still very active even now in determining the fate of their future societies. So in a nutshell, my exposure began both through the church, to some degree through the military, in terms of maybe rejecting some of the prior ideas that I had first enlisted with, but also through some of these great church history books, as well as travel writing.
Now, what is your firsthand experience actually living in Syria? That you spent some considerable time there. You became fluent in the language. You made friends there. You said you got married. If you don't mind, maybe in about a minute, giving us some of that background.
Well, I'm going to stop you there. Sadly, I did not become fluent in the language, despite many attempts. Let's say I can get around in a taxi, or maybe a kind of traveler's knowledge, a very weak one, but I'm a lifelong learner. But one of the things, look, first, I entered Syria for the first time from Lebanon, and I was much younger then, and of course, and so my parents literally forbade me from going to Assad's Syria. It's sort of this, imagined in the Western and American mind as a scary place. So I actually promised my parents I wouldn't go to Damascus. And it turns out I was staying at a monastery in northern Lebanon, a beautiful Orthodox monastery called Our Lady of Hamatura. And you can go there now. It's a wonderful place built into the side of a cliff. I was there praying, minding my own business. And a church group, a kind of college-age church group from Damascus came on retreat. And at the end of their stay, they asked me to come back and visit Syria with them. And I got to say, at first, I was very nervous. I mean, what do you hear about Syria? You hear about there's this bad guy dictator named Assad, and there's a kind of long-running, decades-long war off and on between Israel and Syria. You think Islam, you think that somehow, I think my vision of what Syria would be like was something more akin to what Saudi Arabia is actually like, a kind of hardened Islamic autocracy or closed society. Instead, I discovered what was largely a secular society. I discovered a place where Christians, they thrive. And I'm talking pre-2011 Syria, before the war. And not just thrive, but are almost given a favored position, if you will, in Syrian society as, and I hate to use the word minority because it's a little misleading, but a protected minority. And honestly, I spent most of my time in major cities like Damascus and Aleppo. These places are much like any other city you might go in the world. You go there and women are not covered with veils. It's rare that you actually see the full Islamic coverings, especially in a big cosmopolitan area like Damascus. Instead, you see European styles. You see cell phones better than I ever had. You see.
Do they have Huawei cell phones there?
No.
Because we can't have those in here.
Yeah, they might actually. They might. I don't remember this. Much of this experience is pre-2011, so I'm sure they do now. That's a funny point, right? But a very an exciting nightlife, something happening all the time. Alcohol. You can drink alcohol on the streets in many Syrian public places. It's more like a taboo in terms of public mores and nothing legally against it, if that makes sense. But one thing that we get across in this book is that contrary to the popular narrative in the media, is that the Syrian state, for all its significant flaws, is one of the last secular states in the Middle East. And sadly, again, this is part of my, change of mind, change of heart by the end of my Marine Corps duty. Sadly, the United States, starting with, especially under President Bush in the early 2000s, again after 9/11, and 2003 goes into Iraq and topples a secular dictator. And we all know what happens later. We can talk about that or get into that a little later in this interview.
Let's jump into that really briefly. What was the West foreign policy in the Middle East since 9/11?
Everyone knows the term, the so-called global war on terror. It was anything but. We went around toppling what were largely secular dictators, starting with Saddam Hussein. And then under Obama, there's Muammar Gaddafi. We tried to overthrow Assad. And these places are by no means perfect. Many of these leaders are thugs and have committed war crimes. But we often go in like a bull in a china shop, overthrow what is initially or was a stable system. And sometimes we arm and train radical Islamists who are much worse than the original government. And then the place just burns, as Iraq has been burning really for much of the last almost couple decades since Saddam was overthrown. You have the rise and birth of ISIS. Libya is still fractured into something like 3 or 4 competing governments. Much of the country ruled by radical jihadists that NATO funded and armed. I've written articles based on Hillary Clinton's emails that prove that they had real-time knowledge that NATO weapons were going to jihadists, and it's a similar story in Syria, where we fund and train radical Islamists, jihadists. Literally, Islamic State received some of these weapons that, through covert means, we just went and handed out on the battlefield. Sometimes through the Saudis or Qataris or other Gulf Arab allies. But
Brad,
yeah,
why would we spend billions of dollars to bring in radical Islamic regimes? I thought we have the world's biggest, strongest military, so that we could be the safest country in the world. So why would they do such an obviously contradictory policy to such an aim?
Well, again, one of the in the book we try not to get too heavily geopolitical, but you can't not get geopolitical. I mean, on that note, initially we had shopped this around to a few different large publishing houses, and consistently what we were told, and this was the experience, it was too Christian for the secular publishing houses or political publishing houses, and too political for the Christian publishing houses. And so there is a geopolitical narrative woven throughout what are primarily firsthand accounts, spiritual testimonies of suffering and endurance, and even witnessing martyrdom and kidnappings, things like this. But yes, one of the themes is the why. Just like you asked, why would the United States do this? And something we get into also through some of the eyewitness interviews is the long game. I think the long game has always been about regime change in Tehran. And then you have sort of lesser reasons like oil and resources. I mean, at this moment, the United States is occupying about a third of Syria's northeast oil and gas rich region. And the great thing about Trump is that he often just said what the cold hard truth or reality is, that a more sort of polished politician like Obama never just openly stated, secure the oil, right? We're there, we're going to take the oil. And so that's a big element. But I would say that the whole project of the global war on terror, started with the neocons. And the neocons, of course, have a very ideological, democratize the world, America shall be the global enforcer of democracy and so on. And that's the sort of propaganda element. But the other major driving, I think, thrust of the neocons was ultimately regime change in Tehran. And of course, Assad represents a crucial link in the Tehran, Damascus, Beirut, Hezbollah axis. And then you have ultimately Israel as well. Of course, Syria is, in many of these countries that we've overthrown have long been enemy number one of Israel. And Israel is America's closest ally. And of course, that's a major reason. And so I'd say those three reasons.
Now, that being said, there's Fox contributor Ralph Peters, and he argued in an article called Blood Borders that, to quote him, ethnic cleansing works. And so what sort of real traction do such thinkers have in the news media complex and military industrial complex? Is that part and parcel of the neocon policy, or is this the extreme fringes of it?
Well, Ralph Peters is a very establishment guy. I mean, he speaks from the inside. And, if there's one thing that, whether it's Democrats, Republicans, I mean, whoever's in power, whoever's in the White House, one thing that seems to stay pretty much the same across administrations, foreign policy wise, remains a kind of American imperialist attitude toward the Middle East. And so, yeah, I'd say what Ralph Peters represents is pretty mainstream within, I don't know, what we might call the deep state, if you will.
And so they want ethnic cleansing?
No, so that map you're referring to, which Condoleezza Rice, Bush's national
but I'm
advisor,
quoting him, ethnic cleansing works. I mean, that's the kind of a cold statement.
Right. So that map you're referring to, which you can see this thinking echoed in Condoleezza Rice, in real time back in the mid 2000s under the Bush administration, is this idea that the United States will help, really through the tip of a Tomahawk missile, recreate or give birth to a new Middle East. And they envisioned literally drawing a new map based on sectarian alignment. And so maybe to get back to the original, theme that I talked about of the U.S. going around overthrowing secular autocrats or secular dictators. Well, I mentioned Israel as the United States obviously being close to Israel, but the United States has also worked hand in glove with the Saudis, the Sunni Saudi monarchy, which practices and exports the most extreme radical vision of Islam in existence for the past 300 years, Wahhabism. And so much of our policy also favors Sunnis, especially in the context of the Sunni tensions, the long-running Sunni war, if you will, with Shia Iran. So especially starting with the neocons, there was a very conscious effort to back both the Sunnis in any conflict, and obviously, of course, do Israel's bidding as well. And to get back to Ralph Peters, in this mindset, well, there had to be some inconvenient minorities in these places that would have to be dealt with, that would have to be off, that would have to be pushed to the sidelines, if not, wholesale slaughters and massacres. And of course, first and foremost, you have the Christians, you have the Alawites, for example, you have other non-radical Sunni groups. One example are Sufis, or anyone practicing a kind of folk Islam, and that would look like going to like tombs of old quote unquote prophets, or if Islamic saints, if you will, things that would be considered apostate or heretical within the strict Saudi style version of Islam. And yeah, that references to the Ralph Peters map, which I've written about. Ralph Peters asked the question, essentially, for the U.S. and West to get its way, or to kind of fulfill its policy vision of what an ideal Middle East would look like, how would we draw the boundaries? And of course, he drew the boundaries in a very sectarian way. And there was really, sadly, no place for Christians. And it's amazing. It seems the kind of what was predicted in this map, which this map, my understanding is, was literally like taught at West Point, as a legitimate policy option. We saw much of this blood borders concept play out, where Christians and other religious minorities were just thrown under the bus, or we should even say thrown to the lions in our pursuit of ousting Assad. This happened, people don't realize this happened in Libya as well. There are Orthodox churches in Libya. There was a Greek Orthodox church in Tripoli that came under mortar and bullet fire from the so-called moderate rebels that Obama and Hillary were arming. So this didn't just happen in Syria, certainly not. But we've seen, in terms of martyrdom and persecution of Christians, modern day persecution in Syria like no other. Sadly, there's a U.S. hand behind it.
Now, using Syria as a case study, as the map here, I think it's around 1980. It's showing the ethnic alignments geographically in the country of Syria. They're mostly Sunni, they're Alawites, and in the cities, it's pretty much mixed between everyone. And generally speaking, the Christian influence tends to be mostly in the cities. So let me ask you a kind two-part question, and just as a brief answer, why are Christians mostly in the cities in Syria? And how do Alawites dominate Syrian politics when they're just 12% of the population?
Well, I mean, no map is perfect, and that map, I think, is a bit limited, especially with the Christian presence. I mean, if I drew the map, there would be much more yellow, representing the Christian presence along the coast between Tartus and Latakia. But you also have a lot more Christians around Hama, and certainly a lot in Damascus. And you have a lot of ancient Christian communities in the south as well, where some of the apostles literally visited and preached the gospel. But yes, this trend, it does tend to be true. In my experience, if we want to talk about what we might truly call a moderate Sunni, or a more secular or nominal Sunni, most of those are going to be in the cities. And if you want to encounter a kind of hardline Muslim Brotherhood adherent, or a Salafi, or a Wahhabi type extremist Muslim, you're probably more often going to find them in the countryside. And I think that's an historical trend, and probably over a long period of time, Christians tended to favor the more cosmopolitan, business-oriented, education-oriented cities. To answer your first question. Now, as far as the Alawites go, this has more to do with the Sykes-Picot agreements, and that the era that World War era, World Wars I and II, where literally the map of the modern Middle East was drawn by European powers in the sort of post-Ottoman collapse as well as the post-World Wars. And the French are the ones that really favored an Alawite military corps. I mean, if we're going to blame anyone on the Alawites being very dominant in Damascus in terms of government power, or Assad himself, we would blame the French. They're the ones that did this thing of they would want to cultivate a kind of favored group to rule. They did this in Africa as well. The Brits did this to some degree. You always have to have your sort of puppet group to rule in your stead. And naturally, over time, that creates tension. But the whole idea of an Alawite government in Syria is itself misleading. I would first and foremost describe the Ba'athist government as, well, a secular Arab, pan-Arab nationalist movement. And
let me interrupt. Why were Arab nationalist movements that were socialist, why did they tend towards secular?
Well, after, again, the retreat of the imperial powers, whether it's the Brits in Egypt or the Brits in Palestine, the French in Syria, Lebanon, after this retreat, you're kind of left with two paths in the early 20th century Middle East. You had the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood out of Egypt, and then the Muslim Brotherhood, especially in a pretty extreme form, became sort of transplanted in Syria, or very active in Syria early on, in that kind of post-imperial fragmented political situation. You had that choice, or you had the secular socialist thinkers who wanted to base society not on religion, not on the Quran, but not on Islam, but on a kind of nationalist Arab secular identity. And so many of the Christians, as we talk about, especially in the introduction, naturally are going to favor something that would lean secular and not an Islamic polity, not something that where the Quran is enshrined in the Constitution. And so that's actually why, as we also talk about, many of the founders of the early Arab secular movements were Christians. In fact, almost all the major political movements in the Arab world of the early to mid 20th century were founded by Christians. And
so, that being said, Assad Syria is not exactly democratic in the way we view freedom. And for those who have never been outside the United States, they think we have freedom because we could call the president a poopy head. But if you want to sell toilet paper to the public, you'll need to go through 4 different state agencies, file taxes, and all these forms. And so outside of, let's say, the United States, what we see are large degrees of personal freedom. You can do whatever you want in your house. You can do whatever you want in your business, but no real political freedom. So maybe very briefly, could you describe how that appears in Syria?
Yeah, and this is a paradox that I've long tried to describe in essays or even the book, my co-author and I, this paradox of Syria as politically closed but socially and religiously tolerant. And it's a weird paradox. I would say Saddam Hussein's Iraq was also like that. Certainly not an ideal situation, but people don't realize that these are societies that were birthed in war, literally birthed in war. And I mean, Syria has been in a perpetual state of war, an official state of war, for more than half a century with the state of Israel, since Israel's founding in 1948. This is in large part also because, some of the territory that Israel literally claims right now to this day, especially the Golan Heights, is historically Syrian sovereign territory. So no modern state would be okay with that, would be happy with, another relatively new state, new kid on the block just coming and taking their territory. And so, what that's created is a very closed political system. Any society at war is sadly going to drift into that kind of centralization, that kind of autocratic mode. And my co-author and I in this book We try to set out to paint a realist picture. We want to convey reality and not ideology. So nothing I say here, nothing I say that we say in the book should ever be taken as an excuse or justification for the horrible and true crimes committed in the name of the Syrian state or the Iraqi state or the Libyan state. But as an American, I'm actually, to some degree, if I'm responsible for any government or can affect any change, I'm responsible for my own as a taxpaying citizen. So that's why much of our criticisms in terms of some of the horrors of recent U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East are aimed at Washington, at our own government, because that's the only one we might ever hope to influence.
Now, for those who are following this, we have Brad Hoff on. He's the co-author of Syria Crucified. The link for the website, if you want to buy the book and more information, is in the info bar below. Now, that being said, we spoke about this closeness in politics, this perpetual state of war to justify and to enable really this sort of ruling clique to control Syria. So I imagine Assad does have real opposition. But there's also these fake elements of opposition that come up in Syria Crucified, foreigners that have nothing to do with Syria. So could you tell us who the real opposition is, who makes them up in Syria, and who are the fake elements that seem to be the majority of that opposition?
Well, this is going to be a bit controversial, but my take on the events of spring 2011 is this, that there was real unhappiness. There was a real ground movement, or let's say democratic, human rights focused movement that demanded reform, that wanted to see things change. But at the same time, we see evidence simultaneous to this of a jihadist insurgency that was sort of, the switch was flipped on, activated, even I would say from the outside. And this is in the context of the so-called Arab Spring. One of my favorite Middle East history professors, his name is Assad Abu Khalil. He teaches at one of the University of California campuses.
No relation, right?
Right. He points out that the term Arab Spring itself was essentially first coined in the halls of the Pentagon. This was, the name itself is a kind of bit of propaganda that defined an entire movement. When a lot of the initial books, I've read one of the books that came out immediately after Libya, it was called Arab Spring, Libyan Winter. Most of these societies have actually experienced not a springtime, but a long, never-ending now, sadly, winter, right? And so I would say that from the very start in 2011, we see evidence of an externally funded and supported insurgency to overthrow Assad. Now, sadly, whatever democratic political internal opposition there was, and this is not controversial, even very anti-Assad pundits will point this out. Well, they were killed. They were killed by the jihadists that were being sponsored from the outside. And so what you had was the most radical elements coming to the surface. And frankly, I think many planners in Washington understand that even going back to the 1980s Soviet-Afghan war, if you want to cause damage to a society, if you want to, fund and arm an insurgency, well, who are the most effective fighters on the ground? It's not going to be some guy waving a human rights UN flag or something like that. It's going to be the hardened jihadists, sadly. And so that kind of realpolitik, I think, is what drove U.S. planners, especially during those early days of the war. So I would say that, yes, there's a legitimate opposition. Sadly, it was by and large killed off by the guys that the U.S. supported.
Yeah, essentially these gang members. I mean, reading from the book, so these are firsthand accounts from people from Syria. And in Ruba's story, which I'm sort of pronouncing wrong, she quotes her brother who said, "I lost my money. I lost my business. I'm not going to lose my children to ISIS." And so she says, he joined the army right now to fight them back. And he's one of the soldiers. He told me Today we captured 10 Afghanis. He'll tell my mom stories. Today we've had a Chinese guy in Kamishili, a suicide bomber. They're not even Syrians. There are even people from Somalia coming to fight in Syria. If it was about democracy, what does Somalia and Afghanistan want from democracy in Syria? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't. In another story, in Maria's story, she says this outrageous statement. And it's outrageous not because it's not true, but because the truth is so outrageous. She says about her neighbors in Idlib, which I'm sorry I'm pronouncing wrong. The people from Idlib who left told us there are Chechny, i.e. Chechens. They are Pakistani. They are Saudian. They are Kuwaitian. A few of them are Syrian. Most of them are strangers. They put their hands on all Christians' properties because it's like a gift from them after the war. They can do whatever they want with it. And they put the people, Chechny, like around 3,000 people with their families. So they put them in these places. And so you or your co-author were like, it's a kind of bizarre statement. Are you sure you mean they're moving Chechens to Syria? Aren't they from Chechnya? And Maria responds, yes, a huge amount of people, Chechny with their families. So they put them there. They brought big trucks. They empty everything from 2 floors like it's full with everything and everything is new. They're occupying our land, our properties, just because we're Christian and nothing else. So it's like some sort of horrible combination of illegal immigration with armies that displace Christians is what they're describing. Could you maybe give a little more context in those statements?
Well, sadly, that very family, Maria's family, I mean, I've confirmed. I still keep in contact with some of the people we interviewed, and their family homes are still right now, this moment, being occupied by foreigners. And this is, yes, that's one of the nationalities or ethnicities that we kept hearing over and over again, Chechens. A lot of people don't realize that Chechens made up some of the top military leadership of ISIS. And, Turkey, NATO member Turkey, right, basically opened up their border, the Syria's northern border. It was just a jihadi highway for years. And Chechens in particular, and all these other nationalities mentioned in the book, just poured in. And, once they got across the border, they were able to get often U.S. weaponry, European weaponry, money. And, some of your listeners might think some of this sounds over the top, astounding, a shock. I've never heard this. But I can assure you that this is what we're talking about now. The foreign fighters, by and large, occupying much of Idlib and taking homes from Christians, literally living in them right now. This has been confirmed in mainstream media. This has been since confirmed in mainstream reporting. Of course, you go back 2013, 2014, 2015, you say any of this, anyone that knew this was happening in real time, you were attacked, you were maligned, you were canceled. Oh, you must be an Assad supporter. Any rational analysis or deeper reflection or questioning at the time, especially at the sort of intensity of how polarized the Syria debate was, looking, outside looking in, you were attacked. I mean, I have been to some degree doxxed, attacked online for reporting in the way that I reported that questioned the official, the whole conflict is as simple as, a Nazi monster murderer named Assad versus Jeffersonian Democrats rising up in the streets. And in fact,
blessed are those who suffer for righteousness' sake.
So go ahead. Sorry.
Well, blessed are those who suffer for righteousness' sake.
Right.
So
one quick point. We actually footnote. There's an endnote where we reference a 2015 State Department document. The State Department puts out an annual terrorism report, which sort of surveys, the rise of terrorism around the world every year. And in 2015, they published the report for the year before, 2014. The State Department admitted that some, want to say they said 144,000 foreign fighters had flooded into Syria by that point. And so, the sad reality is, while the kind of Western masses or American masses were being fed propaganda on the Syria conflict, on the Syria war, the U.S. officials themselves knew in real time what was going on. And sadly, we see that theme repeated in other conflicts.
Now, how well armed were the beginning insurgencies in 2011? Like, how did they get big items like tanks?
Well, that took some time. I doubt you saw any quote unquote Free Syrian Army guys. That was the kind of first round of the so-called moderate rebel opposition. I doubt you would have seen Free Syrian Army guys driving around in tanks by 2011. You would have seen that more by 2012. Much of the tanks you might see that later on, showed up with like ISIS. Probably these were more often tanks seized from the Syrian army, or even the Iraqi army across the border. The main weaponry that the West and the Saudis shipped in tended to be very sophisticated anti-tank missiles, like guided tow missiles, very high tech, that could easily take out a tank or a large vehicle or the side of a building. Obviously heavy machine guns, assault rifles, communications equipment, probably bomb making materials. We have a leaked NSA document that The Intercept reported on a few years back, showing that the Saudis were not just giving some of these jihadi insurgents, bombs essentially to make roadside bombs or things like this, but they were actually directing their operations. I mean, literally saying, go attack the airport, Damascus International Airport, on this date. You have X amount of, I don't know, whatever it was, C4, or I forget what the actual document referenced, and go do it. And that's how much we've learned since the conflict.
Now, on another note, why do all sides in this conflict use chemical weapons? Aren't they of limited actual military effectiveness?
Yes. You're probably referencing some of the things that the U.S. Military and intelligence learned from the Iran-Iraq War. And if you've ever researched that, it's since in the early 2000s to mid 2000s come out that during the Iran-Iraq War, when the U.S. was friends with Saddam, we actually helped him with his chemical weapons program in order to attack the Iranians. You can also find declassified Marine Corps documents where they studied real-time battlefield chemical attacks, often launched again by the Iraqis on Iranian positions. It was an 8-year-long war. It's devastating, probably the most deadly war in the entirety of the modern Middle East, even more than the Syrian war. And you have Pentagon documents that observed in real time that often these were not very effective, especially dependent on weather conditions or even the wind. But you bring up a very controversial thing, and I mean, I liked how you framed it. For one, we know that of course Assad is accused of unleashing chemical weapons on his people many times. This was one of the early accusations, especially in 2013. But few people know that the first time that the United Nations commented on it, and I can show you to a 2013 UN document detailing the first usage of chemical weapons in Syria, they actually accused the rebels of using chemical weapons. And so, I'm one who doesn't think that whole question is an open and shut case, but that might be a question for another future.
Yeah, that's there's been a Russian investigation said that these things, lack of a better term, looked homemade. They weren't professional military grade chemical weapons, and so that means just the rebels used them in that event. But in any event, it looks like one side opened Pandora's box and the other side retaliated for, I suppose, retaliation's sake. because these weapons aren't even terribly effective at killing civilians. There's just better weapons than chemical weapons. Now, let me ask this question. The Civil War created a refugee crisis. The West, with loving, open arms, accepted the permanent resettlement of Syrian refugees. My question for you is, why? And why has the Church of Antioch condemned this resettlement?
Well, I would say that the way you framed that is perhaps overstated. Based on what I know, Syrians coming into this country were highly restricted from the start. They were encouraged to go to Europe. But I would really, to get to the point of the matter, the sad theme that I've seen in my experience of Syria and also my studies and interviews with everyone we talk about in the book is that the U.S., while shipping weapons in, and especially France and Europe, shipped weapons in and encouraged the Christians to depart. Essentially holding the church and holding Christians hostage. It's like, get on board with our regime change train or else. There's literally WikiLeaks a number of years ago leaked a high level, or what purported to be a high level Saudi government document where Saudi Arabia's foreign minister was essentially telling the Vatican, because of course the Vatican is, a kind of state, right? It's not just a kind of spiritual headquarters for the Roman Catholic Church. They have diplomats and things like that. But it's a diplomatic cable where the Saudis are telling the Vatican, hey, back our efforts publicly to oust Assad, and we will spare the Christians. We will ensure the Christians survive. And, I would say that that's a real insight into what the Western and Gulf allies were all about in terms of the Christians. We're going to do this thing. We're going to arm radical Sunni jihadists. We're going to oust Assad, who by and large protects you. So either get out of the way or die. And I'm almost paraphrasing some of the people we interviewed, some of the Syrian Christians we interviewed for the book. And so the Church of Antioch, in what is really at the time a little known, little publicized statement in 2014, called this a Trojan horse strategy. The idea that, under the guise of democracy, in the name of democracy, the West is sort of gonna get their hand in there in Syria in the name of doing good and overthrow Assad. When the end result is going to be a lot of people will die, especially the Christians. And now hearkening back to that Ralph Peters, ethnic cleansing is a good thing. Horrible quote, right? But this is sadly what guides some of these people.
So is it a sort of hypocrisy that the West pretends to care about minority rights, but if these minorities are Orthodox Christians in Syria, they're treated as disposable?
Yeah, to even just more broadly, and this is something I started to see at the tail end of my Marine Corps service through my own reading and getting into history. And then later, when I got out through traveling, this was sort of confirmed. The whole falsehood of the war on terror narrative, is the fact that the United States has for decades been tied at the hip with Saudi Arabia. As I previously mentioned, this is the most radical, hardened Islamic state, literally it's an Islamic state, in the world today. And the US is best friends with them. You cannot be a religious minority in the modern Saudi state and practice freely. In fact, the other side of the kind of Arab Spring coin that was never reported on is the fact that you had millions of Shia Muslims living in the eastern part of Saudi Arabia, and they attempted their own Arab Spring. Of course, that's the Arab Spring that didn't get any coverage or attention. The Saudis ruthlessly stamped it out. In fact, if you were a Shia that went out to the streets and protested, you could face execution, and you can look this up. In the past few years, Saudi Arabia has sentenced to death and beheaded people for literally protesting. And it's typically if they are a religious minority, a Shia. It'll be called, they'll brand it terrorism or something like that, or seeking to undermine the state. But the whole the whole post 9/11 war on terror mythology starts with that. If we're going to go around into these foreign countries and this kind of military adventurism and overthrow governments in the name of human rights, why are we tied at the hip with the #1 exporter of terrorism? U.S. officials now admit that the Saudis, the Qataris, even to some degree probably the Emiratis, funded the rise of ISIS as, primary funders. The U.S. role, I think, in the rise of ISIS was much more indirect. Essentially, we were handing out weapons to different factions who often took these very weapons over to ISIS. But the Saudi role was much more direct.
Now, let me ask you this. Midway through the insurgency, the mass media changed the name of ISIS to ISIL, just like face covering, a face mask became face coverings, Kiev became Kiev. Is this some sort of social program where they just switched the name on you?
No, that has just more to do with how you translate or even transliterate Daesh, or Daesh is the acronym from the Arabic. No, it's just a matter of, if you're going to say Islamic State in Iraq and Al-Shem, or Shem is an ancient name for Syria, or Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, which Levant is just a kind of older English term for Syria. So no, I don't see any much behind that. What you're getting at is absolutely true, because what we were fed for years is the so-called idea of a moderate rebel, or even the name Free Syrian Army itself was completely false and misleading. The Free Syrian Army from the start was more of an umbrella group under which many, many different factions operated. Some of them more extreme, some of them less extreme. But the majority of the Free Syrian Army, as we saw, it was just a bunch of Islamists, because when the whole Free Syrian Army project collapsed, many of them ended up going to what was then called Al-Nusra Front, or and the current iteration is basically occupying Idlib, and then the other part largely went to ISIS and all kinds of different fanatical Islamic groups, but the Free Syrian Army itself was a marketing campaign, right? To basically convince the public, let's say, or convince even political leaders in Congress that, hey, we need to get these people weapons. But it started with the whole idea of I call it the mythical moderates. So what the basic concepts you're pointing to is real. This sort of playing with words in order to affect policy and manipulate people.
So why do Syrian Christians think so fondly of the Assad regime? In reading your book, Syria Crucified, the links in the info bar, they pretty much, it's like this golden age until a bunch of Iraqi refugees kind of tanked the economy in the late 2000s. Why do they speak so fondly of Assad when essentially he's a military dictator?
Well, I think, what anyone's going to see, throughout the book, I wouldn't say that there's one view of Assad. And there's not one Syrian Christian view even of the crisis. There are kind of common points of emphasis among everyone we interviewed. There are some basics that pretty much all Syrian Christians I've ever talked to have in common. And it ranges from viewing Assad as a thug, as corrupt, and as a lesser evil, to being a loyalist, to very positively seeing in Assad a kind of symbol of the modern Syrian state and the secular pluralism it represents. So that might be an overstatement to say that even most Syrian Christians have some kind of personal devotion or love to Assad. I try to tell people, and what I found, it was never about the man. It was never about the leader himself. It was more about simply the stability he represents, and the fact that if he's ousted tomorrow, it will become a Somali-style chaotic Islamic faction wasteland of also competing external powers. And so in my experience, that's more the kind of nuance that drives Syrian Christian thinking on Assad.
So in short, though, they're not saying, oh, he's super great, but he's by far the best alternative.
Yeah, I mean, he's better than, look, the out of the Frankenstein monster Islamic factions that arose from this war, the Muslim Brotherhood is probably the least bad. Uh, and yet, a Muslim Brotherhood leader uh, would be far worse for the Christians any day if he took power. I mean, look what happened briefly in Egypt when there was a Muslim Brotherhood leader. The church was running scared.
Now, let me ask this question. It might be too narrow, so if you don't know the answer to this, we'll skip it. Senator Rand Paul, back in the day, favored arming the Kurds against the militant Sunnis. What were the drawbacks of such a policy?
Yeah, I mean, that's unfortunate because Senator Rand Paul is fantastic on a lot of things, but not everything. I mean, I'm pretty much a principled non-interventionist, right? I tend to stick with the position that, and I think this is borne out by recent history, you know, you get involved
Was
in a
your
conflict.
congressional district Ron Paul?
No. It'd be cooler if it was, though. I mean, there have been actual studies, recent studies done. I believe one is out of the University of Chicago that attempted to empirically study multiple conflicts and theaters where there was covert aid to an insurgency coming out of the West. And the scholars, the authors concluded that in every case, it resulted in more suffering, more death for the civilian population. And so, the whole Kurdish project, well, in northeast Syria at least, ended where we are today, with the Kurds being used as a kind of proxy boots on the ground force by the United States. And so we send maybe 1,000 or so special forces trainers, and the Kurdish so-called Syrian Democratic Forces are kind of main boots on the ground there to kind of keep that leverage over Assad by cutting off his energy resources. And I mean, this is all part of the sanctions regimen. It's all about, the war is over, Assad won, and it's all about squeezing the Syrian population. It's all about squeezing the Syrian government, and simply more people suffer. And again, there's a kind of public propaganda side to these things. And then there's the sort of internal, I think, real geostrategic strategy stuff kind of going on, right? So if I recall, the whole arming the Kurdish thing happened with, okay, here's a kind of minority or a group we can get behind because, yeah, they're kind of like secular. In fact, they're leftists, but we won't get into that. And so, hey, let's give them weapons. And what do you know? It ends up with a kind of perpetual U.S. occupation, like what we have now.
Now, let's talk about how the war kind of at least starts getting decreased. And this really is a story about the Russian intervention in Syria. How was that decisive in bringing peace? And why didn't they intervene sooner?
Well, for one, the Syrian government invited its Russian ally into Syria. And people don't realize that Russia has had a relationship to Syria going back at least 3 decades, back to the Soviet era. Russia's only deep water Mediterranean port is off the Syrian coast. And Syria has always been pretty strategically important for a kind of Russian presence or access, if you will, to the Mediterranean, again, through that naval port. And I don't know ultimately what motivated the thinking of each side, but I would speculate that from Russia's perspective, if Assad fell, you would see something like the Islamic State or an equally bad fanatical group in power in Damascus, and Russia couldn't stomach that a mere 24-hour drive from their border. So from Russia's perspective, I would venture to say it would be akin to the possibility of an Islamic State takeover of Honduras. Let's imagine, a state in southern Mexico. Could the U.S. ever stomach that? No, I think not. I think they would intervene right away. And that's something like, I think, what you had that drove Russia's strategic thinking when it came to Syria. You would, if Assad was on the ropes, you were again, what that would mean if the government collapses is an Islamic State right there in the heart of the Middle East. And again, I'm not exaggerating. If you drive from northern Syria to the borders of Russia, you can make it in less than 24 hours.
And obviously, that's how a lot of the Chechens are getting there. And so, like, being that they intervened years later into the war, was their interest always the same, and they were just looking for the opportunity, or what changed?
Well, I mean, even from a Syrian side, it's a big thing to invite a foreign military power, into your country, no matter how much it's going to help or not. Throughout the war, I think there's been this misconception that whether it's the Russians coming in or the Iranians coming in, that somehow this immediately erodes Syrian state sovereignty. Well, the Syrians are very conscious of this, of wanting to maintain decision-making, and I'm talking about government leaders, and not wanting to give up or erode that sovereignty. And, but I don't look at Russia's intervention in Syria as some, shocking or even necessarily unjust thing. I think if you had a mirror situation involving one of our own allies, we would intervene in whatever place it is tomorrow, if that makes sense.
Now, do you have an opinion, as someone formerly in the military, how Russian personnel weapon systems performed in that conflict?
Yeah, I mean, to some degree. I mean, all I can do at this moment is maybe direct you to what a lot of people with expertise in the region say and how they're comparing it to the current tragic situation in Ukraine. I would say that Russia utilized a lot more air power in Syria, because you also had vast sections of whole cities, or sometimes entire towns, that were in the hands of the jihadist anti-Assad militants, and so Russia would just blast away without giving it a second thought. And whereas in Ukraine, I think you see less air power being used thus far, which is probably why also there are reports of a higher than expected Russian death toll. That's the only thing I can really say on that. As far as effectiveness of specific weapon systems, I don't know. My expertise is very limited on that.
Now, that being said, do you remember, was it the Central Military District that actually was the section of the Russian military that intervened in Syria?
I haven't brushed up on that in a while. I don't know.
Okay, because I find it interesting that they would use more air power in Syria than they would in many respects. It'd be obviously a much more challenging war in Ukraine, and perhaps simply because there's more opposition to Russian air power in Ukraine. They wouldn't want to lose as many assets there. Do you have any opinion on that?
Well, I mean, my thinking in terms of this kind of comparison between Russian military in Syria versus Russian military in Ukraine is that, the Russians might be thinking that, if eventually they're going to try to, I don't know, occupy or rule some part of Ukraine, whether the eastern half or just the Donbass region or the whole thing, which it's not looking like that's the case now. The thinking might be, well, we have to, be over these people one day, and we don't want to alienate them too much. Whereas in Syria, I think the Russian thinking was a place like Idlib, it's all Al-Qaeda linked jihadists, and so, it's going to be blasted away. And I hate to even talk in these broad terms and broad strokes, because naturally innocent people, children, right, suffer and are killed. But that's the best I could speculate on that.
Now, that being said, how much Russian tourism goes to Syria? Is Syria seen from the average Russian as like somewhere that's like close to them, sort of like, I don't know, the Caribbean would be for Americans? Is there like a large Russian presence that where Russians would be familiar in some respects to Syrians, sort of like maybe Chinese tourists would be in half the world?
Actually, well, I remember being in Damascus, and a friend of mine pointed out a large uh, apartment building in the city, and she said, we call that Little Russia because that's where all the Russian engineers live. So yes, there's long been a kind of Russian work presence in Syria. There's a Russian cultural center in downtown Damascus. And I would say even Christian spiritual pilgrimage attracts a lot of Russians. I had seen a lot of Russians. There's actually a resident Russian Orthodox priest in Damascus who's part of what's called a Russian representation church. So a lot of people don't realize that some patriarchates, some autocephalous Orthodox churches, if they can afford it, will have a kind of church embassy in various countries. And so as a kind of direct communications liaison on just daily or monthly church matters. And so the Moscow Patriarchate actually has a beautiful Russian Orthodox embassy, if you will, with a large chapel inside in Damascus. And so I've attended there. I've met the Russian Orthodox priest there, or at least before the war, the one who was there before the war. And there are links between cultural and spiritual links between Russia and Syria because of the Antiochian Patriarchate, because you have many Orthodox holy sites still to this day scattered throughout Syria, especially many inside and around Damascus. And you will see Russian pilgrimages to these places, just like Russians will make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, to the Holy Land.
Now, was that Russian church affected at all by this war?
I recall a few years ago seeing mortar shells landing in the area. Other than that, I don't know specifics. Sadly, as many wars go, you pay close attention to every single location or every single church early on, and then as things spiral into chaos, it's harder to keep track of every particular place or church. And of course, in 2013, the most visible just total destruction of an entire small city or town happened in Malula, which we talked about in chapter 1. But yes, clearly the jihadists from the earliest couple of years were just outright attacking Christian sites, Christian places, churches that really had no strategic military value whatsoever.
And they were using holy places, latrines, and terrible things. What effect have the 2019-2020 sanctions have on Syria's Christians? And I'll have a follow-up to this question.
So we thought it was important to address this in the book, and you'll find it addressed especially toward the end of the book. Syria has really fallen off the media radar, and we wanted to try to get a message out to people with this book that, believe it or not, the war in many parts of the country is over, and yet suffering has increased for many just average Syrians, especially also Syrian Christians, because of far-reaching Western and US-led sanctions. I mean, essentially, again, the Syrian state emerged victorious out of this horrific and tragic war. And the Western response has been not to attempt to rebuild or just sort of move forward any way possible while acknowledging the kind of lesser evil presence of the Assad government. Instead, the policy is now just put a stranglehold on the entire country and on the entire population. And, there's runaway inflation. Wages have stayed the same, even as a carton of eggs now literally costs the equivalent of something like $15 to $20 on an average Syrian salary that might be equivalent to $150 a month. There's shortage of energy, of fuel, of natural gas for heating homes. There's on and off electricity. The sanctions represent an intentioned effort of the West to, again, strangle and punish the government. But what we see with sanctions throughout recent history is that the common people suffer. And if anything, it will only increase the common people's dependency on the government.
And so it's counterproductive, because when people are desperate and there's this already socialist government there, they're going to have to depend upon that socialist government. And on another note, then, is Syria going to end up joining China's Belt and Road initiative?
Well, for the past couple of years, there have been major inroads in terms of China in Syria and in Damascus. And so I think maybe long haul, yes. China has certainly backed, let's say, has been a quiet backer of Damascus. This is also in part because, again, we were kind of listing out the different foreign jihadist nationalities present in Syria. Uyghurs, Chinese Muslims, have also traveled to Syria to join the jihadist insurgency against Assad. The Chinese government is very aware of this and has been aware of it for years, and this is part of the rationale for them quietly backing or supporting the Syrian state. So China, believe it or not, actually has a kind of counterterrorism interest in Syria, because, again, you have Chinese nationals that have traveled to Syria to fight in the jihad against the Syrian state.
And for what purpose? So that they could kind of learn and equip themselves and then go back to China and fight?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure, but, China and the government there, for all its serious faults, they're pretty pragmatic. So
This being said, they're pragmatic. What's pragmatic, if at all? Being that pragmatism is a philosophy, the only school of philosophy ever invented in the United States. How are we being pragmatic? What are these sanctions accomplishing to keep up, to make Americans safer?
Well, I don't actually believe that much of Washington's foreign policy makes any real practical sense. Sadly,
then why do it? They're just stupid? I mean, that's usually not the real answer to these questions.
Well, I mean, we have allies in the Middle East. And again, I previously mentioned Israel and Saudi Arabia as the foremost. And, we tend to do what our Saudi and Israeli friends want us to do. And both of these countries have very powerful political lobbies in Washington, D.C. And I'd say that's an element of it. Also, look, we've long ago labeled Assad as a war criminal, a butcher, a state sponsor of terror. And so this is perhaps part of the long game of a future regime change war part 2, sadly.
But isn't this in the end just going to thrust Syria into the economic and geopolitical orbit of China, who's the second focal point on Earth? And these sanctions on Russia, isn't that just going to put them again into the economic and geopolitical orbit of China? It's almost as if we are building up China's power, that these people are going to have to rely upon them. They're going to have to trade through China to get around sanctions. It's going to end up dumping the dollar's reserve currency, because then the yuan's going to become the means of exchange, because we're not going to stop trade with China. It almost seems like this is all working in China's hands.
I mean, the simple answer to your questions are yes, yes, and yes. I mean, that's what we're seeing playing out over the past years of deteriorated relations between the U.S. and Russia. And you go back to, the whole Russiagate frenzy during the entirety of the Trump administration. I mean, the only thing this ultimately did in terms of a grand scale is push Moscow and Beijing, who were, for much of their modern history, enemies, well, now they're, they more recently became frenemies, and now actually toasting buddies. I mean, there's literally photographs of their leaders drinking champagne together. So yes, that's a great point.
And just so the audience knows, we are interviewing Brad Hoff, co-author of Syria Crucified. Information. We're getting more of the geopolitical background of a lot of these issues. In this book, Syria Crucified covers the stories of actual Syrian Christians and their experiences in Syria before and during the war there. And it's a good way for you guys to get informed from Ancient Faith Press. So it's definitely an excellent book. I only have a couple more questions, then we'll try to jam in a couple audience questions. So please begin asking now. That being said, now that Ukraine's on everyone's radar, Russia's military intervention in Ukraine, Russia's so successful in Syria, it appears maybe not successful in Ukraine. What do you think the effects of sanctions against Russia will be on their military?
Well, so far, nothing. Nothing in terms of, I think Russia's aims and intent has really been deterred by sanctions. Again, similar to what I said about Syria, the sad reality is sanctions don't typically hurt a country's leader. They only hurt a population, and they only increase the suffering of the common Russian people. They also serve to distance both sides from diplomacy. I mean, this is a tragedy. I, as an American, don't feel like I have to take one side or the other, even though there's all this pressure from people to. I pray that this war will find a speedy and peaceful end. But the fact is, during all these series of Russia-Ukraine negotiations, the current one of which was in Istanbul, hosted by Turkey this week. I mean, the reality is the United States is not in the room. The United States has no diplomats in the room. And of course, as we know, when it comes to any global crisis or issue of policy, the United States is always there. The United States always has to have its hand in something. And the sad fact is, U.S. diplomacy has taken a far back seat in favor of these sanctions that are serving to escalate and escalate and escalate. And sadly, maybe to a point where there's no off-ramp. Instead of diplomacy, the United States is continuing to not just ship weapons to the Ukrainians, but absolutely bragging about it and being very open about it. And even right up to the eve of the February 24th Russian invasion of Ukraine, the State Department was literally almost on a daily basis putting photographs of, anti-tank missiles. Probably there were Stinger missiles in the batches as well, or at least there probably are now, positively bragging about it. So, I mean, sadly, sanctions are part of this whole total package of escalation, which ensures, again, that diplomacy is made more and more impossible. And then this in turn will result in more suffering for also the Ukrainians who are under the bombs. Sanctions and the whole U.S., I think, policy right now toward Ukraine is not at all geared toward a peaceful diplomatic resolution.
And as I pointed out in a previous show, you can tell how the Ukrainian diplomats are dressing that they're not there to cut the conflict short. The idea is to prolong it at this point, though recently in Turkey, at least everyone was well dressed and not wearing hats in the room. So maybe the Ukrainian population is starting to buckle and not just want to do strictly what the West wants, which is to prolong this conflict and make it an ulcer for Russia.
Well, but if I could say one quick thing, I mean, I think people are probably going to find some of what we're saying a bit of a surprise or a bit shocking, but I would encourage your viewers to go back a week ago. President Zelensky did an interview with CNN's Fareed Zakaria. And I was surprised that Zelensky was this open about it. They were talking about Ukraine's ascendancy to NATO, which, as we know, is largely what this long-running conflict has been about. And Zelensky said that NATO and US leaders told him, no, you will never join NATO. This is before the conflict. This is before the invasion. They told him, no, you will never join NATO, but we need you to keep a public face or present a public posture that, yes, there is still hope for you to join NATO. And this is probably one of the most important pieces of information, interviews straight from the horse's mouth, straight from Zelensky himself. In that context, he chided Washington and Western leaders who had for years promised Ukraine a path to NATO membership. And now when, stand up to Russia, and then Russia invades and, NATO is on the sidelines. Here, we'll give you some weapons. Again, these are crazy policies that will only sadly end up in more death and suffering and prolonging the war. But I encourage people to go and find that Fareed Zakaria interview with Zelensky, where he straight up says, yeah, I was secretly told, no, there's no chance. We're never going to join NATO, but you need to just tell the world that you're going to join NATO. And as you know, it was only a matter of a couple of weeks ago, Zelensky started to say, okay, we've cooled on NATO membership. We want to talk about neutrality. No, we will never join NATO. This is heartbreaking. It's tragic because it's like, I wish this had been the public policy before this disastrous, this horrific war, this invasion.
Now, the sanctions, what do you think their effects on the Russian economy will be? And then as a result, their global Christian missions?
That's a big question. I don't know. And I don't know even necessarily that the Russian government itself knows what's in store. Look, I will say that this is a major, like, world-changing event. And in terms of predictions, I don't know, and I don't, if you know, I know it's not good. That's all I'm going to say about that.
All I could say is my only firsthand knowledge is it's affected obviously the parishes in Cambodia that are part of the Moscow Patriarchate. And ever since it's begun, literally people following this YouTube channel are the tip of the spear. And we've raised thousands of dollars. Last time I checked, over $5,500. And that's through this alone, not any collections in churches, where I know there's at least more than another $1,000 for the parishes in Cambodia, because their regular contributors have been Russians sending rubles to Cambodia. And so what's going to happen to the Russian Exarchate in Africa? This is going to be positively devastating to Russian evangelism and the Russians historically in recent history in the Orthodox Church, and I say recent, the last few centuries, and to this day have been amongst the best missionary churches in Orthodoxy. And so I see this as positively devastating. And sadly, any policy for Russia to have to endure sanctions is going to have a negative effect on Orthodox missions, especially because Russia is such a big player in that. But let me ask you one last question, then we have a couple audience questions. Is someone personally invested in the plight of Syria's Orthodox Christians, approving of the positive effects of Russia's intervention on Assad's behalf? So you've already said all that already. What do you think the effects of Russian intervention in Ukraine will be for Orthodox Christians, particularly those in Western Ukraine?
That's a tough question. First off, I've seen a lot of what I would call confused and misleading commentary lately on this whole question. Especially you'll see these articles, even in conservative journals like the National Review, that I think really posit way too much overlap between church and state and Russia. So first and foremost, people need to realize that the church is not the state and the state is not the church. In fact, the first statement out of the bishops in Kiev, and I mean the bishops that are under the Moscow Patriarchate, was to point out that this is a conflict between the government and armed forces of Russia and the government and armed forces of Ukraine. And I would say that looming even above that, from the Russian perspective, I'm not justifying the invasion or anything like this, but people just need to think in terms of realism and not, emotionalism and ideology. Russia sees this as ultimately a showdown with NATO, a war with NATO, and a war to prevent NATO on Russia's borders, right? And so I think that even among Orthodox, you'll find too much of an assumption that somehow the invading Russian forces, represent Orthodoxy, or really anything having to do with Orthodoxy, in terms of like the church's mission, and at the same time, on the Ukrainian side as well. It's a tragic thing where you have two states, and you have a NATO alliance, and you have Orthodox Christians caught in the middle on both sides.
I'll just say that Russia has publicly stated, and I think this was actually from Putin, that they're dropping their demands to denazify Ukraine, which means any Western Ukrainian elements, mostly units. They're not going to be taken out of the Ukrainian military in any peace deal. Zelensky's obviously going to be beholden to people like the Azov Battalion and those who fought their heads off to keep him in power. And so I cannot help but see how the canonical Church Ukraine will be persecuted as a result of this war. But being that Western Ukraine is not going to have a regime change, and they're going to be radicalized, not in a Muslim way, but radicalized politically against Russia. I just don't see how this bodes well for canonical Orthodox Christians in Ukraine.
Well, no, that's true, and certainly that these things are part of it, absolutely, and even broadly too. One of the first laws of the 2014 post-coup government was to attempt to outlaw the Russian language.
Yep.
Which, of course, Ukrainians in Donbass speak, as well as much of the entire country, really.
Yep.
And so, yes, that's all part of it, absolutely.
So we have this question: in post-war urban Syria, is it a safe place to live?
By and large, yes. There is actually still a Christian town close to the front lines of occupied Idlib. It's called Maherda. They've been shelled and attacked almost on a weekly basis for years. It's an entirely Orthodox stronghold of, I think, probably 25,000 people right there near Al-Qaeda occupied Idlib. But other than that, yes, Aleppo, Damascus, Homs, Hama, by and large are safe places right now. What a person will face is, yes, daily economic hardship, lack of resources, power, electricity that goes off and on, possible.
Oh, so it's California.
Yeah, right. There you go.
So we have this. If DC can see someone's bank account for being Russian, by the way, also January 6th insurrectionists, so to say, they had bank accounts frozen. So this was already in the United States. Why can't they seize yours for being a Christian dissident? Are we mainstreaming, like essentially financially destroying anyone that's against the mainstream narrative?
If you tell me this 2 years ago, I wouldn't believe you. But sadly, the question makes a very good point. I mean, look, we're
Is
actually.
there a part of the Bible that talks about that? Something about buying and selling?
Yeah, right. Yeah. This is very real, actually, right now. Just on this controversial Russia-Ukraine question itself, I said at the outset when we started talking about this subject, I don't feel that I, as an American, need to firmly support any side. I pray for a swift, peaceful ending to this tragedy. But in Europe, already the European Central Bank is restricting, access to loans and certain bank accounts on the mere basis that you might have a Russian ethnicity or nationality. I mean, we see this. There is a kind of cancel culture that obviously went kind of, straight, like shifted on a dime, straight from the kind of question anything related to the pandemic or public policy, and you'll be destroyed, you'll be canceled in the public sphere. And literally a week later, it was the Ukraine-Russia question. And you suddenly have all these people getting super ideological over what's a complex, at least 7-8 year long running conflict. And even before that, it goes back 28 years to the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, a very complex conflict. And I find that the people who couldn't find Ukraine on a map a mere month or month and a half ago are now often the biggest advocates for canceling you if you happen to voice the wrong views on the subject. It's scary. So yes, I can absolutely see this happening to just Christians eventually for having dissident views. Absolutely.
Well, we've always been at war with East Asia or Eurasia. I forget which. We've been always at war with one of them, I'm sure, whoever they tell me. So that being said,
it'll switch. I mean, I don't know where we'll be in 6 months, but suddenly everyone will discover a crisis in Malta, and then they'll wear Malta t-shirts. I mean,
eventually they're going to wise up and realize that we are deconstructing our whole economy, our whole geopolitical influence, or flushing it all down the toilet in order to make China stronger. And eventually we're going to realize, oh, we've gone too far. And then all of a sudden they're going to want to encircle China, and Russia's going to be part of that bag probably. So anyway, that aside, this has been a great interview. I think we've unpacked a lot of stuff people have never heard before, a lot of stuff that which I want to do in interviews isn't strictly in the book. So I want you to read this book and get all sorts of new information that you'll see then in a fuller light thanks to this interview. So do you have any last words, comments, any plugs you would like to make?
Actually, yes. And this is going to sound a little off topic, but it's not. One of the things that frustrated me at the start of both this whole tragic Russia-Ukraine war, but also the American public's kind of bandwagon, let's call it bandwagon virtue signaling about, I mean, literally the narrative for most people is one day a big bad guy named Putin woke up on the wrong side of the bed and decided to invade people. And it's that simple. And then people get, really ideological about the whole thing where, again, as I said, they probably couldn't find Ukraine on a map 2 months ago. I would like to call people's attention to something that I've followed for a long, long time alongside Syria. And many of the same issues are at play in Syria. And that's Yemen. I mean, guess what part of the world or what conflict the United Nations calls right now for the past 2 or 3 years the world's worst humanitarian disaster? Not Ukraine, not even Syria, Yemen, where according to UN numbers, and I'm talking a conservative figure, over 360,000 people have died, over 10,000 children. And again, these might be lower end estimates. In a war where you have an overwhelming military force, the Saudis, in alliance with the United States and the UAE, bombing civilians from the air. And this isn't some distant conflict. The last major bombings of civilian cities by the Saudi-US alliance was literally last week, probably 3 days ago, actually. A kind of ceasefire has taken effect before Ramadan within this last couple of days. But this is what kind of frustrates me of both the American media and kind of the American masses themselves, this sort of single issue thinking. Look up what's been happening in Yemen, look up the US role in it, and then ask yourself, does the United States really care about civilians, democracy, and human rights? And on that controversial note, I'll leave off.
Well, props to you for writing Syria Crucified, and props to Ancient Faith Press for publishing this book. Wish you all the best, and I encourage, if all my viewers of this show has blessed them, to purchase Syria Crucified and support Brad Hoff and Zachary Wingard, which I'm hoping I'm pronouncing right, in writing this book. It's just excellent from beginning to end, and I recommend everyone to read it. Also, for those who are watching, I just want to give my thanks for their generous donations, almost $6,000 to this point, for the parishes in Cambodia. I will keep everyone updated with the future financial needs, which we hope will dissipate if there's peace in Ukraine. So please pray for that. Please bless the parishes of Cambodia at orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. Everyone who's donated, their names have all been sent there. They're being prayed for by the priest there. It's very much appreciated. Please step up during Lent, fast, take the $5 saved from the meal and that you skipped and bless the parish of Cambodia or give some other alms. And so I always support orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate for those parishes in Cambodia. Every dollar donated goes to those parishes. Well, Brad, it's been an excellent interview. Hopefully in the future, we'll get a sequel or some more insight. You are it's just tough to get all your information, try to pack into an hour and a half. And so let me just extend my gratitude again on behalf of myself and the audience.
Great discussion. Thanks so much, Craig.
So I will end the show as I end all of them by quoting Jesus' Sirach, fight to death for the truth, and the Lord God will fight for you. God bless you all. Have a great day.